Welcome, everyone, to the Land is Not Empty webinar. We want to start first to let you know that if you want the Spanish translation, you can go to chat. Esa chat puedes ver cómo puedes oír en español. And Carlos also has instructions there how to get on. So before we start, I'd like to start with a prayer. In this prayer is also acknowledging the finding of the 215 children at the Kamloops Indian Reservation in British Columbia about a week ago. So please join me in a prayer. God, creator of all things, we come before you with heavy hearts. The finding of the graves of 215 precious children is overwhelming. We pray for their families and communities most impacted by this horrific discovery. We pray for healing. Acknowledging complete healing does not come without justice. The evils of the Doctrine of Discovery that allowed such horrific things to happen to Indigenous people throughout the Americas continue today. Walk with those in need of comfort, hope, and healing. Shaken us who have benefited from the Doctrine of Discovery to learn and move into action to stop this legacy. May we all hold on to hope for a more just and loving world. Amen. I just want to thank you everyone for coming. This is going to be about an hour and a half. We will start off with some questions and then Sarah will read from the book and then we'll wrap up with another question and then we'll open it up for an answer, question and answer time from you. So if you have questions, we ask that you put them into the chat as we go along. Laura, let me introduce my co-host. I'm Iris de Leon Hartshorn with Mennonite USA, and Laura is with Minnow Media, with Herald Press, and she will be also co-hosting with me today on the webinar.
Hey everyone, it's great to be here, to see all of your faces. So I'm Laura Leonard. I'm the acquisitions editor at Herald Press, which is the book publishing arm of Minnow Media. And we are publishing Sarah's book, The Land is Not Empty, Following Jesus in Dismantling of the Doctrine of Discovery, that we're here to talk about today. And it is my delight to introduce Sarah Augustine. Sarah's new book will be out on June 22nd, and you can buy that directly from Herald Press or wherever books are sold. So to introduce Sarah Augustine, who is of Pueblo Tewa descent, is founder and co-chair of the Coalition to Dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery and executive director of the Dispute Resolution Center of Yakima and Kittitas counties. She's also the co-founder of Suriname Indigenous Health Fund, where she has advocated for vulnerable Indigenous peoples since 2004. She has represented the interests of Indigenous community partners to their own governments, the Inter-American Development Bank, the United Nations, the Organization of American States Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the World Health Organization, and a host of other international actors, including corporate interests. She employs a shuttle diplomacy and group decision-making strategies to de-escalate conflict and establish common ground between communities and external interests. She has written for Sojourners, The Mennonite, and other publications, and she is an adjunct professor at Heritage University. She and her husband, Dan Peplow, and their son live in the Yakima Valley of Washington. And she's here today to talk to us about her new book, which will be out with Herald Press on June 22nd. And Sarah, it's so great to have you here today to talk about this book, which I have had a chance to read, and it's really fantastic. I look forward to all of the rest of you being able to get a copy in your hands, being able to read it. And I'm going to start off today's conversation with a question for you, Sarah. You write about the importance of solidarity that is embodied, a conscious change in position, where those who are not threatened with oppression step across a line from the sidelines to sharing the fate of the oppressed. You also talk about how structural sin cannot be solved on an individual level, so our response can't be rooted in individual actions. Could you talk more about what it would look like for us to stand in true solidarity with Indigenous peoples and communities?
You bet. Thanks so much for hosting this event. It's a pleasure to be here. It's wonderful to see so many faces. And I want to just acknowledge that my mother-in-law, Etta Peplow, is here and honor her for being here. And my cousin, Sue Hoffman, is also here. So thank you for choosing to be here. It's great to see you and so many friends and relatives. So I want to begin today by just acknowledging that the land that I'm standing on right now is on the ceded territories of the Confederated Bands and Tribes of the Yakama Nation. And just a note about that, I happen to live on the homeland of the Yakama Nation, but I'm at work right now because this is my best internet connection in rural Washington. And so I'm on the ceded territory now. And I want to explain what that means. The Yakama Nation formed a treaty with the federal government of the United States in 1855 to bring an end to conflict. And so at that time, they ceded territory. In other words, they said, you know, we recognize this is our traditional land, and we are going to retain this portion, and the ceded territory we are going to give up. They still have some rights on the ceded territory to hunting and fishing and et cetera. But I want to make that really clear that we still acknowledge it as the homeland of the Yakama Nation. So that's where I'm standing. And so I want to begin by just sort of talking about, to answer your question, Laura, directly, to think about, you know, a metaphor that I use a lot is sort of thinking of yourself, those of you who are parents who have children, those of you who are aspiring to have children someday, to think of yourself as having a child that has a weakness in their lungs, and it requires for them to have clean air. That breathing polluted air would cause severe disability or even death. What would you be willing to do to advocate for clean air for your child? What would you be willing to do? And you know, if you'd say to yourself, yeah, I'd be willing to go talk to a senator about that. I would be willing to go talk to the city council. Would you be willing to go talk to the electricity plant in your community? And most people would say, yes, I would be willing to do that. So if it were difficult to do, would you still do it? If it were embarrassing, if it were awkward, if a lot of people said no, would you still do it? Would you? I mean, that's a question. Would you back down because, well, I don't want to make that other person feel uncomfortable. Maybe they don't share the same values I do. You probably would still do it, right? Because that's your baby, this vulnerable person that you love. And so, the flesh of your flesh. And to me, that is crossing the line, right? When you're saying, hey, I'm not the one that has a lung deficiency, right? But my child does. So that is my cause now, that I am going to step into that role and be a persistent advocate to the point where I'm not going to let this go. I'm going to keep going. And that is what solidarity is all about. That's solidarity. Okay? It's not a symbolic action. It is changing your position to stand with vulnerable peoples who need additional people to stand with them. And so it is seeking significant change to address structural violence. And so, and I really want to say that, and then I'm going to talk about what that looks like. But so I had this amazing, enormous privilege here where I live in the homeland of the Yakama people, to be invited into conversation. I held a year-long conversation at the Dispute Resolution Center that I direct for the families and relatives of missing and murdered Indigenous women. So I spent a year hosting this conversation, really thinking together as a group and inviting decision makers to figure out what is it that we need in this community to address this massive structural injustice. And, we put a plan together, and we said, okay, look, these are the things we need. We need, I won't go over everything that we talked about, but one of them was that we would need a response team that would be as responsive as if there were a natural disaster, right? Just like FEMA shows up in a natural disaster, we need a response team like that. It's going to show up and be present. We need it to be coordinated across state agencies, right? So we came up with this plan. We took it to the legislature here in Washington State, and we went to one representative in particular and said, look, respectfully, we spent this time, working on this, and this is what we'd like you to do. And this representative said to us, these women, Indigenous women, presenting this and saying, hey, this is what we want to collaborate and see how we can do this. And first of all, she was 2 hours late. We drove an hour and a half to go to this meeting. And she said, I only work on projects that I can get in one session. This isn't a one session win. Basically tough luck. So I thought, okay, well, I'm there with these folks who are humble, respectful, prepared, spend a year of their lives trying to work on this. And so, several of the people I was with just, said, okay. Well, those of you who know me know that have a tend towards the bossy, and said, excuse me, sit back down. We are not done. And by the way, you work for us, not the other way around. And you want to work in one session? This is not a one session problem, my friend. And we came here and we expect your time for you to attend to this, because this problem is not going away. So whatever your political ambitions may be, we need to address this. Okay. Addressing structural change when we are stepping into ambiguity, right? Because there's no pat answer. It's not like you're going to get a home run on the first try. But we're going to stand together, and we are going to work on it consistently, because it's necessary for the health of our whole community. And so I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like, what this has looked like in my life. A big reason to write this book, the primary reason is to get people to be part of our movement, to dismantle the doctrine of discovery. And so ordinary people, all kinds of ordinary people are involved in this work now. So many ordinary people. That is to say, you don't need a special kind of degree, you don't need a special preparation. Anybody can do this work. And I want to tell you what it looks like in my life. So there's a couple that I know, Pat and Bill Shaver, who are on our advisory board for, I think, 12 years for Suriname Indigenous Health Fund. Had never been to Suriname and stood with us in that work, and continued to work tirelessly year after year, committing time and effort. I can think of some pastors who've been working on the coalition itself, who we formed in 2014. That's the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition, which is an Anabaptist movement. And so I'm thinking of Sherry Hostetler, who's a co-founder of the movement, who has she has had a standing conversation with me on the phone since 2014, every single Friday, if you can imagine the commitment. And we've done all that. We've caused all kinds of trouble together. We've gone to the U.S. Treasury together. We've gone to the Senate together, a lot of different things, large and small. And I'm thinking about Carol Rose, who's also a pastor she's in Tucson, and she's been on the coalition. She's working with the Apache at Standing Rock tirelessly with her community, figuring out what repair looks like from their point of view in her community. So, and so it is engaging in work that is greater than ourselves. The powers that we are resisting are huge. And those powers are well-funded and well-organized. But you know what? They're wrong, and they're doomed to fail, because the logic of oppression and suppression and extraction is a logic that runs counter to the forces of life. And so, the powers that that we're sort of organizing against are big and scary, but we're smart and capable. And when we work together collectively, we can do it. You know, and I think sometimes people say, hey, you know, Sarah, can I sign a letter? Can I sign a petition? It's like, sometimes that's a tactic, but that's not, you know, that's not quite going to do it. What we can do is we can train together as congregations and groups. These problems weren't created by individuals, they're created by systems. And it's going to take systems to imagine alternatives and working together to do that. At the congregational level, we have a mechanism for that. And through our denominations, congregations working together to persuade denominations and our systems to join together with the spirit of life in seeking justice.
Great, Sarah. To kind of follow up on that, you mentioned, you know, how long you've been doing this work for many years now, and I'm wondering, as someone who has long been doing this work, what wisdom or warning would you impart to those of us who might just be beginning this work, really wanting to step into it?
Yeah. So one thing I want to say at the very beginning is that this work is amazingly rewarding. It's fabulously rewarding in every way. And I want to say, you know, something that I've heard from my elders, people who have spent time, you know, working with me and helping me to grow, have reminded me, you know, Sarah, creation is ongoing. It's not a thing that was a few day project. You know, it is happening now. It's in the process of creation, and joining together with the Creator in that process of creation is the greatest thing from my point of view that I can do with my life. And joining together with others to do that is amazingly rewarding. So the people that I know around the world, but especially in the Guiana Shield in South America, we have now, after these years, we have shared a life story. So there's a portion of my life, huge portion of my life spent doing this with these folks. And we now share a life story, and that's awesome. I also want to just say, you know, I want to reframe this idea that I heard when I was growing up and going to youth group and stuff, that God has a plan for your life. And so, which is kind of an individualist way of thinking about things, you know, and reframe that to say, God has a plan. The Creator has a plan. How are you going to use your life to be part of that? And I think that what that does is it provides an opportunity to grow in relationship and to be part of this ongoing process of creation, and to be able to grow, to be part of something that's so much greater than yourself, than anyone's own self. So, you know, I'm teaching a class right now at Goshen. I see some of my students are here. Hello, so glad you're here. Teaching a course on Indigenous rights. And, you know, I recognize people in my life, including students, not just this term, but often are struggling with the conflict, this internal conflict of thinking about, you know, the tension between what we've learned and struggling for own security and doing this. It's hard. It feels like there's tension. And I want to say that my experience working with Indigenous peoples has resolved all of those conflicts for me. There is no conflict internally for me. There is only the struggle for life, and connecting with the Spirit in the context of the Spirit's work. And I want to tell one quick story about this. You know, there was a time in my beloved congregation where I've been a member for many years, decades by now, where I was called out at church. You know, when I first started talking and preaching about Doctrine of Discovery, and, you know, there were people there that said, you know, I've never heard of it. And, you know, basically you're lying about this. You're making it up. It's not really a real thing, you know, and you're trying to make a big deal out of nothing, you know, in terms of advocating for Indigenous peoples. And it's painful. But the process of being part of a movement in relationship, and commitment to patience and commitment to relationship resolves all of these things. So these conflicts become quite minor in the face of this larger thing, which is collaboration in creation with the Creator. So I also want to just say, it's important, it has been important for me to think about an intergenerational timeline. So we're not working for immediate outcomes. For the work that I've been a part of, it's been possible to continue to collaborate with Indigenous peoples because we've eliminated outcomes and a timeline. So it's not about me, getting my, whatever my objective is accomplished in a short period of time. We're thinking about this in an intergenerational way. So what is the impact we're having on the process of creation? What is the impact we're having on the ones that will come after us in terms of protecting life, not just for ourselves, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for all peoples and all life.
And one last piece of this question, just you've talked about this a little bit already, but what do you hope those who step into it, who choose to step into it, will bring to this work?
Oh my gosh, thank you for asking. Collective action. Collective action. That's what I'm hoping for. So in the coalition, I hope I'll have a chance to talk about in more detail. There are certainly pastors and administrators in that work, but they're mostly congregants. Mostly congregants are working together, doing all kinds of stuff. We were able as a coalition to get human rights language in an international law in 2019, which was a year of big gridlock in Congress. And I want to tell you, there were Mennonites all over the country flying to see their senators to work on that, bringing human rights into economic development. And so, and those were not international affairs experts, they're ordinary people. Well, not ordinary, extraordinary Mennonite people and Quaker people, committed people doing that. So for me, what we have to bring is ourselves. That's always the main thing. And then collective action, being able to work together persistently, consistently for change. And I guess I just return really quickly to the metaphor about having a baby who needs to breathe clean air. We all of us have babies like that, honestly. And in the beginning, for me, it feels like, oh, I care about that over there. Then pretty soon it's like, no, that's my baby. I'm responsible for that baby. And then, one day I look up and I say, oh, you know what? It actually is, in fact, my baby. It's every baby, because this is not just a struggle for Indigenous peoples. It's a struggle for all of life. Because the processes of extraction and oppression are destructive to everyone. And so it is interesting that some of the most vulnerable peoples are leading the charge in protecting our world from forces of destruction.
Thank you, Sarah. I think with that last part of how it affects us all leads into this next question. In chapter 9 of your book, My Cosmology, you write about interconnectedness and interdependence. That's something that has been my understanding about how creation is bound together. But I often find it hard in the church, especially around when we talk about climate change and all those kind of things, for the church struggling with seeing why it's so important at times. So why do you think it's so hard of a concept for Christians, especially in the United States, to grasp this understanding and see that the importance it has on our very existence?
Yeah, thank you, Iris. So, I've spent some time thinking about this too, and I can only speak for myself. So I wouldn't presume to speak for the whole church. I can tell you about my experience and some things that I've learned. So, elders that that I've learned from, have spent time teaching me, have shown me and reminded me kindly again and again that a good way to interact with the Creator is through reference in the natural world. So that is to say, showing reverence for the life and the creation that surrounds me. So here where I live, the Yakima people acknowledge at every meal the importance of water as the source of life. Every meal before they eat, they acknowledge that water is life. And that's reverence. It's acknowledging, the people that I come from, the Tewa people, greet the sun every single morning. They get up, even if they're going to sleep in, they get up and go out and greet the sun and acknowledge our dependence on that source of life. And so reverence is this understanding our dependence, our connection to the forces of life, and also, how we fit in that family of things, that we are part of this larger thing that is creation, and that we experience faithfulness in these processes of life, and that we experience the faithfulness of the Creator in those processes as well. And so those are, a few things that I've learned about reverence. And I think that there is this, this other thing that I've been taught too about faith. And so I'm thinking again, as a teenager going to youth group and stuff, that faith is sort of this belief, and this belief in something that you can't see. And there's this kind of delayed reward, right? So if you're good now and you believe in this thing that you can't see, there may be some, in a future, there's going to be some kind of return for that. And that there's really no sort of concept like that in the way that I have been taught in Indigenous thinking, because there's not a faith in something you can't see. It is reverence for all that there is. You know what I mean? The acknowledgement of that you can see it. You can see God. You can see the Creator. It's all around you. The evidence of it is all around you, and sort of demonstrating reverence for that. So I'm going to tell you another story. I've written about this. You guys have probably heard about it, some of you, that in 2004, when I accompanied Dan Peplow, who was at that time a friend from church and is now my husband, the father of my son and daughters. When I accompanied him to Suriname in 2004, I met a woman there, an elder actually, in a small community called Pekimpawika, who kind of told me, we had been at this meeting all day, and she said to me, are you going to help me? She stood up and pointed at me personally and said, are you going to help me? And I said, don't put me on the spot. I basically said, I don't know. I don't know what to do. And she kind of got frustrated and said, either help me or go away. And so I told her, oh yeah, okay, I'll help you. And what I was able to see, over the years of being in relationship with her community, is that I could see what was laying ahead for her community, which is what happened to my community. That they were in the process of losing their land. They were facing death, disease, disability as a result of pollution happening in their land. That there were systems in play to remove them utterly from their land, and that the only choice for survival is complete assimilation. And that's where I find myself, right? A fully assimilated person. So I could look at her story and say, yeah, I know where that's going. And so I have the opportunity to intervene here and partner, and I want to do that. And so, let's see. I want to say that excuse me, that's really irritating. The dominant paradigm and the entitlement that is within it has resulted in manifest destiny. So this dominant paradigm is this idea of, this faith, or this understanding, this entitlement of a God-given right of expansion, right? So this is very much baked into American Christianity, this understanding of that sort of entitlement. So manifest destiny is the belief that Americans were predestined by God to expand from the East Coast to the West Coast, all the way across. And, when my son was in the 3rd grade, just a few years ago, his teacher selected this book, Rush Revere and the Brave Pilgrims. Have you heard of that? Did you know that Rush Limbaugh wrote a series of children's books to teach American exceptionalism to school children? because he felt public education wasn't doing an adequate job. So he wrote this book, and he was giving these away free to all kinds of schools across the United States. So anyway, my son's teacher selected this book to read, and it talks about the need for American children to learn about American exceptionalism and the American dream, which is completely dependent on free and abundant land and the extermination and removal of indigenous peoples from it. So that's what this logic is rooted in, and it's baked in to mainstream Christianity. So I think it's hard, if you've been a beneficiary from that system, to sort of tease that out and try and figure out where to stand. It's a cherished narrative of Christianity to this day. It was in President Trump's inauguration. The prayer that was read at his inauguration talked about this very explicitly. If you were to go to the Billy Graham Museum, the very first display shows Europeans bringing Christianity to the Americas as sort of a demonstration of God's will to bring Christ to the natives. And so, it's very much a part of this narrative. And I think it's hard to sort of think about interconnectedness within that context, or that dominant narrative.
Thank you, Sarah, for answering those questions. We are going to get to some more questions later in just a little bit, but see, we've had more people join since we started. So just a few quick reminders here in the middle of our conversation. Today, we're talking with Sarah Augustine, who's author of the book, The Land is Not Empty, Following Jesus and Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery, which comes out on June 22nd. It's a really powerful prophetic book in which Sarah reframes the colonization of North America as she investigates ways that the doctrine of discovery continues to devastate indigenous cultures, even the planet itself, as it justifies exploitation. It is a powerful call to reckon with the root causes of a legacy that continues to have devastating effects on indigenous peoples around the globe, and a call to recognize how all of our lives and our choices are interwoven. You can buy this book at heraldpress.com, menomedia.org, or wherever books are sold. There's a link in the chat, and I will drop another one. And this book is published by Herald Press, which is the book imprint of Meno Media, an agency of Mennonite Church Canada and Mennonite Church USA. And thanks for being here with us, Sarah. I'll drop the link again for everyone. And then I believe next on our agenda is Sarah will be reading us an excerpt from the book.
Perfect, thank you. So I'm reading from chapter 8. On May 25th, 2020, George Floyd was accused of passing a counterfeit $20 bill to a cashier in Minneapolis. During his arrest, Floyd was killed by Derek Chauvin, a Minneapolis police officer who knelt on Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes. George Floyd's death inspired national outrage, a final straw in a decades-long legacy of police brutality targeting African Americans, especially men. In Portland, Oregon, activists demonstrated publicly almost daily from May through October, drawing crowds each day numbering from hundreds to thousands. In July, the Trump administration deployed federal law enforcement agents to Portland to quell unrest. Federal agents in camouflage and tactical gear arrested dozens of demonstrators, packing them into unmarked vehicles. Televised images of young demonstrators being detained by unidentified federal agents disturbed Bev Barnum, a self-described suburban mother, and she felt she had to act. She had never been involved in demonstrations before, but when she saw young protesters being treated in a way she considered bullying by federal agents, she got involved. She reached out to other women like herself, suburban mothers, by putting out a call on social media to join together in forming a wall of moms that would surround demonstrators. The group assembled with demonstrators wearing bright yellow Wall of Mom t-shirts. As a mother, Bev felt her role was to protect young people. So she put her body between enforcement agents and the youthful demonstrators she felt were under attack. By forming the Wall of Moms, Bev Barnum made a fundamental shift in her position. She and the women who joined her stepped across the line, from the sidelines, watching protests unfold on media from their homes, to the front lines, putting their bodies at risk along with the demonstrators. While they might have felt sympathy for demonstrators while watching from the sidelines, the shift in position committed them to share the fate of demonstrators. The Wall of Moms demonstrated true solidarity. The suburban mothers who originated the group were not relatives of George Floyd. They were not African American and were not the objects of unjust police attention, yet they chose to physically stand with the Black community in their demands for justice. Solidarity is not symbolic. It is a conscious change in position where those who are not threatened with oppression step across the line, from the sidelines to sharing the fate of the oppressed. When those who benefit from structural violence find they cannot tolerate the injustice any longer and join with those harmed by the systems of death, solidarity is the result. I frequently hear people of faith use the word solidarity when they're talking about symbolic action. We signed a letter in solidarity. We went to a meeting in solidarity. But from the position of the oppressed, true solidarity is choosing to join with those under threat by changing position. I appreciate the Wall of Moms as a story of true solidarity, not only because of the work this group of privileged women did to cross the line, but also because of the important work that followed. Ultimately, the Wall of Moms Coalition submitted to the leadership of women of color. In crossing the line, Bev Barnum and the leadership of the Wall of Moms embarked on a bumpy journey where they gained a deep education in the systems of oppression that continue to endanger African Americans in the United States. Ultimately, it was decided that this group needed to be led by the people who have the lived experience of oppression. Crossing the line does not mean you will get to be the hero in the story. It simply means that you have awakened to the reality of oppression that is intolerable, and you've aligned yourself with those who do not live in that condition by choice. It always means giving up power. As long as the dominant culture benefits from the oppression of the vulnerable, aligning oneself with the oppressed will have a cost. The cost of losing the power to oppress, whether actively or passively.
Thank you, Sarah. I mean, that's a really powerful illustration of solidarity and what it means. We have one more question, and then we'll open it up for Q&A session. You know, when I first started to read your book, I was pulled in by the introduction right away. And part of it was, even though you talk about, you know, how you've been totally assimilated, there's still a lot of damage that happens in that process for Indigenous people. And so what I was, the part of the sentence that caught me was, my sense of worthlessness and hopelessness was intended by the most powerful nation on earth. These words I could never have said out loud, but when I read them, I felt them deeply. And these words become tapes in our minds from my own experience. And I'm just wondering if you could share how these words and actions in your own life shaped you, or even, and sometimes I say tried to shape you, because there have been times when you can resist some of those tapes. But sometimes those tapes are so powerful, they're hard to resist. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, you bet. So, I mean, I think first of all, just kind of share a little bit about my life story. You know, I grew up in the underclass, and I spent portions of my youth homeless, with my family, who was also homeless, and I dealt with the shame and the displacement and disorientation of, you know, hunger, just being poor, just straight up being poor. And I know that's a common experience in the United States. And, you know, I really struggled as a young adult with depression and anxiety and isolation and internalized feelings of worthlessness. I was really teased a lot in school, first of all, for being a person of color and looking different. And then also for having secondhand clothes and just, dealing with all the things that kids deal with when you don't have your basic needs met. And so, as a young adult, I kind of just thought, my life story is kind of sad, is really as a result of having dysfunctional parents. So my parents are just these two dysfunctional people. That's just kind of where I left it. It was like, yeah, I'm just going to get as far away as I can, and I'm going to have my own life, and I'm going to pursue the American dream, and I'm going to get an education and be somebody, worthy, a worthy person. And, this sort of understanding of not being enough, or being sort of feeling worthless was reinforced by a drumbeat of white supremacy, at the same time. So this is not all just internal, there's external things that are happening too, So for example, in the 5th grade, I don't know about you guys, which of you are my age, but I think for several generations there, we did the Oregon Trail. Did you guys do the Oregon Trail book? I did. So where you learn about, the movement west and the pioneers and stuff. So we did that, and we read Laura Ingalls Wilder's books, and so there was, at the end of the unit, we all dressed up, and I remember wearing a bonnet and like a period dress and stuff, and came to school, and there was a performer who came. She was, she was dressed up, and she was a professional storyteller, and she was looking at various ones of us and said, "Who are you supposed to be?" And I said, "Oh, I'm dressed up as Laura Ingalls Wilder." And she's like, "You can't be Laura Ingalls Wilder. You're an Indian. Like you're one of the Indians. Like you sit over there." I was like, okay, that's one thing. But growing up in a public education system that doesn't represent my experience at all, and my people are consistently portrayed as bad guys. I'm also Latina. I'm Latina and Native, and if I had a nickel for every time somebody told me to, go back to my country, even though, my family's from here, and so, how many times in my life, recently, even as recently as this last Christmas, have I been followed in stores and accused of shoplifting? I'm almost 50, and I'm still kind of being tailed at, the fabric store, the quilter, like, the rest, but it's not uncommon for me to be tailed and sort of accused of being of stealing. I went to a coffee shop with my husband, not, it's been kind of a while now, but when we lived in Seattle, and it was one of those places where you pay and they give you the cup, and then you go, you serve yourself, and I didn't get a cup, so I asked for the cup, and I was accused of trying to pretending. It was funny thing is my husband, Dan, my amazing partner, happens to be white, right? So he's from the dominant culture. So we're standing right next to each other at the counter, and he got his cup and I didn't get a cup. And then I was scolded and accused of trying to steal a cup to get coffee. I talked the person into giving me a cup of coffee, and she filled it halfway up and was like, "Yeah, well, I was like, hey, can you fill it up?" And she slammed it down and said, "You're lucky you got half a cup." This is like this constant drumbeat, right? It's people of color on this call, you know what I'm talking about. It's not just some ancient thing that happened. It's reinforced constantly, all the time. I'll tell you one more story. I talk about this in the book too, that I won a human rights award early in my life. I was still in college, actually, for doing grassroots organizing around human rights, and I went to a big hotel ballroom to receive the award, and I'd never done something like that before, and it was new to me, and I didn't know where to stand. I went an hour early because wasn't sure where to go, and I was sitting there as the hotel staff are kind of setting up and stuff, and I was sitting there, and the organizer walked in, and she walked straight to me, and I was like, great, she's going to tell me where to stand, what I should do. And she was like, I told her I wasn't sure where to sit. She said, "You shouldn't be sitting at all, start serving the drinks. The catering staff shouldn't be sitting down." So I was like, okay. So I started serving the drinks, and when my college mentor came in, he's like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "Oh, the lady told me to serve the drinks." So you kind of have this internalized feeling of not fitting in or not having value, and then then you have all this going on too at the same time. It's real, man. Like it's a real thing. It's hard to resist that. And so, I kind of thought, hey, if I assimilate well enough, no one will know. I can have an important job. I can get really educated, and somehow I will pass muster. And what I've learned in working on the doctrine of discovery is that there have been more than 200 years of an intention to create the situation that I find myself in. And the design is to permanently remove Indigenous peoples from their lands. So beginning with genocide, and then moving into a policy era of removing Indigenous peoples from their land. And then the next era is the reservation era, shrinking that land base, putting people on the worst land, and then the allotment era, stripping people of even that land, that poor land base. And then the boarding school era, sending children, taking children away from their families and putting them in boarding school. And then urbanization, taking people off the reservation, putting them on buses to go to urban areas, far away from their homes and relatives and families. And then removal of children into foster care. And that was a process that was undertaken together with Christian organizations so that they could be placed in white homes. So these policy eras, 200 years of policy has led to me, this assimilated person who is not quite white, not accepted, right, as being white, but has been removed from my homeland, my people, all of that is by design. So this is something that, I'll just say really, not to belabor the point, Iris, but here I go. At the beginning, at the formation of our country, if you had to prove in the early days of colonization that you were not Black, right? So one drop was enough. And why is that? One drop, because our economy was dependent on having a large supply of free labor. So there wasn't even a question. If you had any African ancestry at all, you were going to be designated as Black. Natives is the opposite, right? We want the smallest number of Native people possible. Why? Because our economy is dependent on a large amount of land that is settled. So you have to, so the way it works for Native people, you have to prove that you're Native, right? You have to demonstrate it with a blood quantum. You have to do that. People who've been removed from their land base, they've been taken away from their relatives, they've been utterly removed. And so that feeling of sort of not fitting and knowing that you're not right is by design. It's by design. So in the United States, I should say, in my state anyway, the high school dropout rate for Natives, 50%. 50% dropout rate. That is a system failing. On the reservation where I live, one of the highest causes of death among teens is suicide. One of the greatest causes of death. That's across the nation for Indigenous youth, because this feeling of being worthless and isolated is by design, and very cleverly done over a long period of time by the most powerful nation on earth. And so, just in response to that process, I also want to say, if I get to the point where I don't blame myself for the situation I'm in, and I look around me and I choose to claim my own dignity, and if I choose to resist those systems, and that's what I'm doing, I'm resisting and calling on people to join me, that's the opposite of the plan, right? It's actually say, no, I'm not going to buy that. I'm going to resist. And I want to say too, I live on a reservation now. It's not my home reservation. It's a reservation where I live now. And what I learned teaching in a Native serving institution is that my story is mundane. There are a lot of people who have a story like mine. There are more people who have a story like mine than are Native than any other. This is it's a common thing. And I'm not alone, but together, it's possible to resist and to work collectively to resist the structures of domination and oppression that oppress not only Indigenous peoples, but all people and are a threat to all of life, to step into that space of ambiguity It's hard, but it is life-giving. It is embodied and it is empowered by the great animator, the spirit of life.
Thank you, Sarah. So we're going to move into a time of Q&A now, opening it up to all of you who are here in attendance. If you have questions for Sarah, please just drop them in the chat. I'll be moderating those, looking to make sure Sarah gets the questions. I'll go ahead. I see we already had one question come up, so I'll go ahead and read that one to you, Sarah. How is the dismantling of the doctrine of discovery different from fighting the societal norms that consider any group a lesser status?
Mm-hmm.
And then they go on to say, is the difference that dismantling the doctrine of discovery focuses mostly on plight of Indigenous peoples who originally inhabited this and other lands? But yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you, Karen and George. Yeah, just looking at what makes this issue different than maybe other justice issues with other oppressed groups.
Sure. And so, so I want to begin by saying, this is a little bit of a nerdy answer, but the doctrine of discovery is a legal doctrine. So we talk about dismantling it. We're talking about dismantling a legal doctrine that is the remaining law of the land in the United States. It is the law in the United States, the doctrine of discovery. Most recently cited as the justification for removing Indigenous people from their lands by Ruth Bader Ginsburg in 2005. She wrote the majority decision for the Supreme Court. So just FYI on that one. And so by illustration, I'm going to tell another story. So if you have heard about apartheid, many of you remember the system of apartheid that happened in South Africa that basically removed tribal African people from their land in South Africa and retained most of the land, I want to say 88%, for settlers who were of Dutch and English descent, right? So the majority of the land base was held by whites, and then Black people were settled on these reserves. They're called these homelands. And so anyway, at some point in history, people in Palestine started to ask themselves, looking back on apartheid, wanted to know how that all worked. And some of them traveled to South Africa to talk with scholars there and find out, say, hey, we noticed a similar process is going on in Palestine, and we want to talk with you, this is recent times, and figure all this out. And you know what they said? They said, oh, we didn't create that. We got it from North America. Canada and the United States created the original reserve systems. Okay, well, that's news to the scholars that are there. And so let me just ask, does anybody remember what year did apartheid come to an end? Do you remember? It was a big year in my life. Do you remember what year that was? I want to say it was like 89 was when Mandela was released. I think 89, and then 92 or 93 was when he was elected president. I want to say something like that. So some time ago. Okay, so who wants to tell me when the reservation era came to an end in the United States? That's right, it's the remaining law of the land. That is the land, that is the law that determines the fate of Indigenous people in the United States. It is the law today. It is the law today. So when we're talking about dismantling the doctrine of discovery, we're talking about dismantling those specific laws and policies that continue to segregate and oppress Indigenous peoples. So, and what I want to say is that, from my point of view, it's not more important than fighting other societal norms. And please don't hear me saying that, but it is a specific thing. It's not we can't just say, hey, there's one big pan thing. It's its own thing, and it's important. And one thing that I really care about a lot in the church, especially, is working intersectionally with other oppressed groups. So I don't feel like, hey, we have this special banner and it's more important than every other. No, all of us have to be struggling collectively for life, because I know that sounds dramatic, but life is what's at stake. We have systems of death right now that are polluting the air, the water, the soil that we depend on. The life support systems that make it possible for human beings to live on this planet are at stake right now. And Indigenous peoples are on the front end of that. They're on the leading end of the impact. And so dismantling the doctrine of discovery is about empowering the people in our world, not just in the United States and Canada, but around the world, who are struggling for the preservation of life. And so, you know, and I also want to point out that the doctrine of discovery is not just in force in the United States, it's in force around the world. It is international law. And the Marshall decision, which is the Supreme Court decision that kind of incorporated the doctrine of discovery into US law, has been cited by every major colonial country on earth. It's been cited by England as the basis for removing indigenous peoples from their land. This is a major civil rights issue here and around the world. And so the one thing I'll say is that dismantling it empowers the people who are trying to preserve water, soil, air, life, the systems of life.
Yeah, while you're talking about what it means to dismantle the doctrine of discovery, we have a question about, so is this is encoded in law, this is a legal thing, so is the strategy a legal strategy? What does the strategy for dismantling the doctrine of discovery look like?
Oh my gosh, so glad you asked, and I've been cautioned not to go nerdy on this, too nerdy on this. So there are, okay, so we have a coalition. It's pretty awesome. It's the Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery Coalition. And there are all different kinds of people who have different skill sets and abilities who are part of that. And we come together and we determine together what campaigns we're going to invest in to do this work. It's a lot. And so I want to say I have strategies, you bet. I talk about them in the book. But I don't want to just sort of hog all that and say, here's our strategy, you know, because it's like, well, it's not up to Sarah Augustine to decide what the strategy is. There's a lot of people who have a lot of strategies. So working together on a lot of different fronts is what a social movement is. I certainly personally chair the structures committee. I don't actually, I so apologize, Danny, who does chair the structures committee. I put my efforts into the structures committee. I used to be the chair of that. I'm not the chair of that anymore. I can't take credit for that. I put my efforts there in Indigenous people's campaigns, seeking to deal with these legal structures. So it's really important to me, but it's not the only way to work on this. There are many ways to do it. We have a very important, effective committee on the coalition that's called the Culture Change Committee. That's chaired by, I don't know who it is. I almost said it was Katarina Friesen, and then I would be misspeaking again because I don't think she's the chair of that committee anymore either, although she's a force behind that, where we are working together to try and change institutional culture. So I think there are a lot of different strategies to dismantle it. And so if I can nerd out for just one moment, I would love to see the the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples adopted as a constitutional amendment in the United States. That is, that's going to take some work, so we better get started.
Yes. All right. I see a question in here about the title, which a reminder for everyone is "The Land is Not Empty, Following Jesus and Dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery." And this question is asking about the connection about that with what we've been talking about. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little more about that, especially that following Jesus part. How do we connect this with our faith? What is the understanding we bring specifically as Christians into this work?
Sure. Yeah. So The Land is Not Empty is based on actually a point of law and the original papal bulls, which are the documents. So many people don't know that these papal bulls that were written by the church formed the basis of the original Law of Nations, the first international law. So these are agreements between European states about who was allowed to take what, and the Catholic Church was the arbiter of that. As these European states formed the technology to go and expand to other continents. So the Catholic Church said, okay, so we're going to write the rules of how this is going to work and who gets to have what. And the doctrine of discovery is a legal doctrine. Whoever discovered the land, that is, whoever planted their flag first, had the first right to that land. And so there is a portion of one of these papal bulls, Rex Pontifex, that says, if a land is terra nullius, which means it's empty, if there aren't Christians living on it. Okay, so it's completely empty if there aren't Christians living on it. So the idea that Indigenous people weren't considered real people, right? According to Terra Nullius. Real people were people who were, actually the term was, ruled by a Christian prince. So this basically means people of European descent are empowered and entitled to living on and owning land, and Native people are not. So the title of my book is The Land is Not Empty, which is just a repudiation of this idea of terra nullius.
Thank you. I see we have a question here about Canada. So he says, there was no official manifest destiny up here in Canada, and the violence was perhaps less overt. The idea was to force adaptation into Europeanness via such things as residential schools. But the results in Canada were pretty much the same, a genocide. Any comments on us people north of the border? So yeah, I know you live in the United States, and yeah, if you could just talk a little bit about maybe what are the differences in the US and Canada situations, and how a response might look any different, if different at all, in Canada.
And so, you know, I'm not Canadian, and of course I have dear Canadian friends who are here with me. So I dare comment on the political narrative in Canada. I don't know, and especially about, you know, how Christianity was formed there. One thing I know is that one of the most effective social movements, Indigenous people's social movements we've ever had in the world was Idle No More, which took place in Canada. And I guess I want to talk about the context in which that movement occurred. So this is when there was an omnibus bill passed in Canada that was taking all but I think 5 or 6 bodies of water, so all fresh water in Canada, taking it out of environmental protection. Okay. This is illegal in Canada to do because you would have to consult with First Nations people before you could do that, pass a law like that. But it was done by the government without consultation. And so the Indigenous people there said, we are going to, this is the omnibus bill C-45. And we're going to resist that. We are going to struggle for our sacred water, because water is life. What I found really interesting about that movement is that, you know, I live in Washington State, which is right on the border with Canada. And I mean, Idle No More got very little play in the US. It was almost as if people felt like, oh, you know, it's a Canadian problem. It's like, oh my gosh, do you know how water works? If you pollute it there, you know, it's going to impact other people in the water system. So why would Canada do this? And I also want to say, I want to frame that Canada is the largest mining concern in the world. You know, so I am a person who works on the impacts of mining on Indigenous peoples. And I want to say Canada is the biggest mining interest. They have the most financial interest in extractive industry from my point of view, any country in the world. So why would C-45 want to take all this water out of environmental protection? Well, why? Because we want to use it for in fracking. We want to be able to use it as retention ponds. We want to be able to use it to move ore and et cetera. Really huge. So, you know, I can't speak to, you know, the process of manifest destiny or the lack thereof. I sort of think of Canada as being more rural. I mean, whatever that means. Of course, there are huge urban centers. Canada is a massive nation, but sort of the understanding of settlement was within a context of land that was harder to settle, I think, you know, and being, so here I am speaking out of school. I apologize, Canadians, if I'm totally blowing it here. But what I'm trying to say is, I think, you know, with or without this understanding of manifest destiny, the outcome is the same. Indigenous people are removed from their lands still. I mean, C-45, that was like not 100 years ago. That was, you know, that was recently. That was under the Harper administration. And that's massive. You know, that's a huge structural change in violation of treaty. And as long as states, you know, as long as the government of Canada has the power to do that, man, they will, you know, I mean, and who is struggling because that misuse of fresh water doesn't just impact Indigenous people, right? It impacts all Canadians. It impacts all human beings. you know, fresh water is well, it's a precious resource. From my point of view, the most precious, second only to air and soil. And so here you have this group of people who are struggling to resist that, and the same forces of oppression are deployed to quell that resistance, right? To quiet it, to suppress it, to silence it. Yeah. So the story of colonization may be different, but I think the outcome is the same.
I see a question here about how you had mentioned your Latina identity as having a Latina identity as well. Wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about the interplay of those two identities for you, what that looks like. And also another part of the question is, how can more Latinx people become involved in dismantling the doctrine of discovery, especially here in the United States and also in their home countries?
Yeah, so here's how much you want to know about me. Yeah, so my dad is Native, my mom's Latina. You know, my mom, it's funny thing about being Latina or Chicano and from the Southwest United States, you know, her family were not recent immigrants. You know, she was from a family that the border crossed. You know, they never crossed a border. The border crossed them, right? So they were people on the land too. She's from Southern Colorado. And but the interesting thing about being mestiza, which my mother was, is that you're a combination of many things, including Indigenous, right? So my mom didn't have an Indigenous identity, or, you know, she didn't have that all worked out, but it was very much part of her heritage, as well, being, you know, having lived on the land with and among Indigenous people for 500 years, you know, so, you know, but anyway, interesting feature about my parents is that they were both orphans, right? So my dad was removed from his family, from his homeland and his family and everything when he was born. At birth, he was removed, sent 300 miles away to an urban center. And my mom, you know, her parents both died by the time she was 11. So, you know, my legacy, like my understanding is, as a person of color, you know, I didn't grow up in a Spanish speaking household, or I didn't grow up on a reservation. My experience as a woman of color has been really a story about oppression without a lot of protective factors, right? So a story of discrimination and oppression, poverty, and like a lot of other people in this country, being blamed. You know, if I'm poor and if I am suffering, it must be because of something I did, right? And so that's the narrative, that's the frame. So, I mean, I think in terms of my Latina identity, and I live in a county that's 50% Latino, or Latinx rather. You know, what I feel for the Latino community that I'm a part of is the necessity to struggle for justice, for immigration reform. I've also had big conversations working on that in my community. And I won't go down in the weeds on that, but that's been a big part of my life and identity, living where I live. Also around improving relations between the community who have been seriously oppressed for generations by way of inequality, immigration inequality. That is also, by the way, intentional and legislated. And then the oppression, let's just say very poor community and police relations as a result of that. And so, you know, I've spent a ton of time working on that, you know, and I work in a dispute resolution center. So I work really hard to try and find systemic solutions together with others, with lots of partners. So I see my Latina identity very much about seeking justice, also seeking justice for my people. You know? And I'm a non-Spanish speaker, and I think that means something. You know, at least where I live, it's like, hey, are you a real Latina if you don't speak Spanish? Well, I don't know the answer. I don't speak Spanish, but I'll tell you what, I still get followed around when I go to, you know, the fabric store. I don't know what that means. You know, I'm still told periodically to go back to Mexico. So, you know, So I mean, I think, you know, the experience of being a woman of color in the US is a story of resistance. Hey, on all sides, on all these brown people that I love, the Native people and the Latinx people. So I'm a part of them and they're a part of me.
I see a question here about land acknowledgement. They say land acknowledgement has become normal or more normal. How can we ensure that it continues to be a meaningful act? And then also, what is the next step that we should normalize? I love that. That's really a great question.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And so land acknowledgement, you know, so often I did some land acknowledgement tonight. Often what I do is I try and if I'm going to be with a group more than once, I'll try and kind of go a little deeper every time and say, hey, you know, I'm on ceded territory. So this is what ceded territory means. You know, I want to be really clear. The United States did not give that reservation to those people. No. Those people ceded their territory to this colonizing power, not the other way around, right? Like they got nothing for free in that bargain, right? So trying to take some time to talk through some of those things. I mean, I will do that, and I think that is meaningful. And it's important to be willing to do that, to learn for ourselves what that means. What does the ceded territory mean? To understand for ourselves what the history is. You know, I have been at a national church gathering and was asked by a national leader, hey, will you do the land acknowledgement? It was in another state other than my own. Could you just, you know, yeah, we're about to go on stage in 15 minutes. Can you do the land acknowledgement? I was like, no. I mean, this person was really like shocked by that. Well, why not? I was like, I don't know anything about the history of this place. What am I going to say? Like, that takes effort. It takes hours of study and finding out, you know, what happened, because I don't want to just, it matters what you say. And so I think investing and deciding, yeah, I'm going to find out what is the history, what happened, and what happened to the people, to the first people, because they're still here, right? Somewhere they are. Somewhere. So, and then I think the next step is seeking relationship with those people, the first people, and saying, okay, I know you're here, I'm here too. And what's a priority for you? And sort of following that, you know, that's a rule of thumb for me, finding out, hey, what matters from your point of view, and then working on that, you know, working on those things that matter. And I think that's the beginning of relationship. It's rooted in humility. I'm not going to come in and problem solve whatever's going on here. What I'm going to do is try and understand from your point of view what's going on, and then partner in that. You know, it's like, you know, I grew up part of my childhood in Colorado, and when there was a snowstorm, you know, it'd be huge snowdrifts, big snow, and you know, the neighbors would get together and kind of figure out how to deal with it. And you'd help. It'd take all day if you're going to dig out your own cars. It takes, you know, neighbors get together and dig them out one at a time. So it's poor people, right? I used to wear socks over my hands in Colorado instead of gloves. You know, poor people get together and figure out, hey, how are we going to work together to dig this neighborhood out? And this is the same kind of thing. You know, you didn't have sort of a bossy neighbor that would go up to a house and say, here, it looks like you need snow removal here. Well, let me show you a Mike across town. He'll blow out your driveway for $80. You know, it's not helpful, man. Like, you need to figure out how we're going to work together to clear the snow out, right? And that's what I'm talking about. I think that's the next step. Just reading a statement isn't it. I think understanding what that history is, and figuring it out, and then working together to see, something's here. How do we address it? And I wanna be part of it, whatever it is.
I see we have a question here about the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. And I know that's something you talk about in your book. So I wonder if you might talk about that a little bit. Tell us what that is for people who don't know, and is that law, and does it trump local laws? Awesome,
you bet. So I call it the UN DRIP. It has a cute nickname, UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It was created in 2007. I should say it wasn't. It took 20 years to create it. It was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2007. And so, like a lot of declarations, UN declarations, it is voluntary. And so the member states, that is the countries that belong to the United Nations, choose whether they're going to voluntarily sign onto it or not. But it's not a binding convention. That is to say, what the member states can choose to do is to adopt it or not. So just because you sign on doesn't mean that you're going to choose to adopt it into your own national law. So it is considered settled international law. That is to say, it's not, nobody's disputing it. It's like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's not disputed. It is a body of law, and it's not binding for member states that are members of the United Nations. So let me talk a little bit about how it came about. So for several decades, Indigenous peoples wanted to create a body of policy that represented their interests, their rights from their own point of view. That's a really important thing to do. When we think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, much of that language is from an individualist perspective, right? Makes sense, we're talking about individuals, unit of analysis. Well, the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights does not do that. It talks about collective rights, because from an Indigenous perspective, that's what matters, right? So the UN DRIP was created as it's like the minimum standard of policy that would meet the minimum requirements of dignity for Indigenous peoples, right? So it's not meant to be the end all, it's just meant to be the minimum requirement. And so Indigenous peoples created this policy, the UN General Assembly adopted it, and in their comments, what they said was, this policy was created to help member states know how to negotiate with their Indigenous peoples. And we encourage member states to take this policy that is created by and for Indigenous peoples and adopt it into their national laws. So before, when somebody was asking me, hey, how would we dismantle the Doctrine of Discovery? And I said, I'll go nerdy on you for a minute. What I suggested is taking the UN DRIP and bringing it into the United States law by adopting it as a constitutional amendment, because a constitutional amendment trumps all previous precedents, just like the end of slavery. And so from my point of view, dismantling the Doctrine of Discovery is on par with ending slavery. Please don't hear me saying, I don't want to rank what's more important or anything, but what I'm saying is that it would take a constitutional amendment to completely reverse a system of oppression that our current economy is based upon, just like slavery was system of oppression that the economy was based upon. So hope I got it all there.
Yes. Okay. I think we have time for potentially one or maybe two more questions. We'll see. But I see a question here. I know this makes up a lot of your work and is very much addressed in the book. So I see a question. You're knowledgeable about gold mining and mercury poisoning in Suriname. Will the Waianae people and culture survive? And how is my retirement account complicit in the survival of the Waianae people and culture? You could talk about that question.
Thank you. Yeah, I didn't stack that. I wonder who put that question in there. It's a good one. Okay, so I'm sorry, Laura. I was too gleeful to hear it. Can you give it in pieces? Maybe, otherwise I'll just answer the last part.
For sure. Well, so the first part is, will the Waianae people and culture survive?
Yeah, so this question is referring to gold mining that occurs in Suriname, South America. And the Waianae are rainforest people that we've worked with for many years. Since 2004, so it's like 17 years we've been working with that people on their efforts for self-determination and controlling what happens in their own lands, where mining concessions are free to come and exploit the natural resources there, since they don't have land rights. And so will the Waianae people survive? So it's a very emotional question for me, because, I want to just begin by saying, survival is a form of resistance. I have a son, I have a little boy who's 12, his name's Micah. And, I've told him before, your very existence is a miracle, because the strongest nation on earth has worked for that to not be, so will the Waianae survive? I hope that my people have survived in me, but my culture is not intact in me, you know. I think about that, you know, I pray, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but I do pray backwards. I pray for my grandmother who's long passed, who I never met, and for healing in our line, the line of our people that was so utterly disrupted when my dad was removed from his people. So, you know, I do pray that way, and I long for healing and renewal in my own line. And so I struggle with the Waianae in the hope that that will not be their fate, that they will have a different fate.
Thank you. And then the second half of the question is, how is my retirement account complicit in the survival of the Waianae people and culture?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think we kind of think of mining companies or corporate mines as being the big bad guys. You know, like they're the rascals, right? They're the ones that are coming in and polluting. But they're doing that because of a lot of shareholders that are making that profitable, right? So they're doing that because it's financially, you know, that's from their point of view, it's a money-making enterprise. And so investment in extraction, I would say gold for sure, but also oil and gas, all of these things. Investment in those things, those are not considered, if you have socially responsible stocks, they don't hit the buzzer in terms of this might not be socially responsible. Social responsible stocks are really rooted on tobacco and firearms. Are you invested in big tobacco or firearms? That's what social responsibility stocks were really originally based on. We don't want to be part of guns or, you know, anything sexually exploitive or liquor, tobacco, that kind of stuff. So mining is come on, it's like a blue chip stock, right? It provides a good return. It's a reliable return. And many of us have 401ks that are heavily invested in those safe investments, right? And so this mining that's occurring somewhere else is to the benefit of shareholders, and something that, you know, I didn't really quite understand, being naive, when I first started working in church structures. And I don't just mean the Mennonite church, I mean a lot of national churches, mainline denominations as well as Anabaptist denominations, is that churches are invested in mining, as are national governments. Canada is heavily invest. I want to say Canada's retirement system is invested in mining. I don't know that to be fact. It's been at least 10 years since I learned that, so I haven't updated that recently, but I'm guessing it's probably still the case in gas and oil. And so, you know, mining that takes place, or all extractive industry, including mining, is creating a return that enables people of privilege to retire. And don't hear me saying that, you know, it's bad to plan ahead or save money. You know, these are all things we want to do. We want to put our kids through college. We want to retire. We don't want to be a burden on someone else. These are all good things. So it feels like, gosh, you know, why would we want to give that up? So that is just one more question. If it were your baby who had a weakness in their lungs and couldn't breathe polluted air, would you be willing to go to shareholders who are invested in air pollution and ask them to stop? If it were your baby, would you be willing? I don't know. I don't know. I'm not going to answer that for you, but I think it's worth asking. I mean, and this is a question, you know, I mean, I feel like, yeah, I'm not going to be invested in mining because I can't do that. I know what it costs. I'm not going to do that. And I'm not going to be invested in any company that's invested in mining. I'm not going to be invested in any company that's invested in extraction, or, you know, or any company that's invested in it. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know, I could be in Microsoft, but they're invested in extraction, right? So, you know what I'm saying? Like, this is the deal. And so, you know, and so here's where I draw on my mandate. This is so, oh my gosh, you guys, please forgive me in advance. Jesus speaks his mandate in the book of Luke. He says, the spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor. What is that good news? Freedom for the oppressed, release for those in bondage, sight for the blind, and jubilee, right? The year of the Lord's favor. So I say, hey, that's Jesus' mandate. I don't think he meant it as sort of symbolic. that's what I read. So I say, hey, that's my mandate too. He must have meant that for me. So so I'm going to say, hey, you know what? My retirement is not more important than the lives of these vulnerable people who would like to be able to live. They would like to just be able to live. The people right now, the Waianae right now, who every baby born is impacted by mercury. That means their nervous system is impacted by mercury pollution. Every baby. I'm not exaggerating. It's a true story. I have the research to prove it. So it's just not, it's not okay.
Well, thank you, Sarah. This is bringing our webinar to a close. First of all, of course, we want to thank Sarah for giving her time and for answering all these questions. We look forward to your book coming out. And I'm hoping others will read it and get better educated on what this means and how you can really work at dismantling racism. And also, like she said, we have a coalition. If you're an Anabaptist, you can ask us more. Catalina Friesen, I think she just put something on the chat, the ways that you might be able to connect. I also want to thank Laura for co-hosting. Thank you, Laura. I want to thanks Carlos Romero for doing the translation in Spanish. I want to thank Caleb, Ben, and Lee, our tech people, and Alicia for helping us to promote this webinar. And of course, I want to thank the participants. Thank you for being with us for this webinar. We appreciate you coming, and thank you for your questions, and we wish you a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.